Okay, here we are. I started the recording again. There is one thing that I realized I forgot to tell you, where you can find the videos of the lectures. The videos are available in a YouTube playlist, and you can find it in my website. I go to my website here, and so you see that in my website, under the page lecture notes, you find here video recordings of the asynchronous and synchronous lectures will be made available on YouTube and Virtual soon after their delivery. And for the YouTube, there is the link, and it's the web page that I opened earlier. For Virtual, you can find it in Panopto. So if I go to General Introduction, it's the page of our course. Here there should be, and probably is not yet there. Okay, it's here, Panopto on the right. So there is the list of the recording. There is also the recordings. There is already the first asynchronous lecture. And then there will be, from tomorrow, the recording of the present day video. Okay, the mic doesn't work. Let me check what's the problem here. Just 1 second. Okay, let's try again. 1 second. Okay, let's try again if something has changed. Okay, very good. Thank you very much. There is a question which I didn't answer in the chat, and it's the long one. I'm not reading it because it's quite long, but this is a relevant question, although it is relevant for for building your academic career. It's not a relevant question in terms of how to read and write a paper. It's relevant in terms of academic assessment of the CVE of candidates for positions. The question is indeed relevant because it's an old question whether a researcher is more positively taken if it is very focused or interdisciplinary. Just 1 second. So in general, in the past, it was not appreciated much that a researcher was interdisciplinary. There was much appreciation, more appreciations for focused researchers. It means researchers publish only on a very specific issue. But recently, there has been a growing appreciation for interdisciplinarity. But this really is depending on the specific discipline. In my discipline, Earth Sciences, which is in a way interdisciplinary by nature, it is appreciated, the interdisciplinarity. In other disciplines, may be less appreciated. One important advice that I give to you, if you are publishing in different fields, is to try to find a thread connecting in a coherent way these disciplines according to your academic evolution. So, for instance, at the beginning of my career, I focused on statistics because it was essential to study hydrology. And then I focused on climate change. And then I focused on new monitoring techniques for earth sciences. So what I try to do in my CV is to explain the connection between these fields in order to explain that I grew up in my career, not by chance, not randomly, but I had a clear project in mind. So this is also what I recommend to you. All the disciplines that you are mentioning there, they are somehow connected. Maybe the more disconnected is road erosion in the forests, but I think you can find a coherent thread connecting them. In order that you have to be prepared during an interview to reply to the question, how would you describe your career path? and your scientific maturation evolution? This is a question that usually happens during interview. And it's important in your CV, and today there is an increasing requirement for narrative CVs rather than very schematic CVs. So in your narrative CV, in any case, I suggest you to include a narrative explaining why, how you evolved your scientific background. Okay, let me go back now to the slides. This slide doesn't say much more of what we said. It just emphasizes on the fact that, once again, there is a difference between media and scientific reports. In a scientific paper, you are essentially communicated to the scientific community. These are the people you want to get as readers. There could be also people that are not really scientists, but still interested in science, in the details, in the methods, and not only in the value of the results for dissemination. So this is why we need to clearly describe methods, data, and reasoning. And you have to be aware, when you read a paper, that you have to look for these components. Okay, so it's you have to look for what is the research question of the paper, and what is the methods that they used, and what is the essence of the results. If the paper is well written, then it's very easy to recognize them, as we will discuss in a moment, or maybe next lecture. But remember, and this is another key take-home message, not all the papers are well written. Not all the scientific papers are well written. Some of them are poorly written. Some of them, even if they are poorly written, they can bring significant results. Some of them, maybe also including those well written, don't convey anything new. So don't assume that any published scientific paper is valuable. There are some papers that have no value. And we have also to learn how to recognize the value of a paper. This is what we want to discuss. And when we will turn to writing, one recommendation I will give to you is try not to write paper just for the sake of writing. You need also to make sure that your message is well taken, is appreciated, because this makes yourself finally recognized. Okay, now, why then scientists write papers? We already anticipated one reason is to communicate, to share discoveries. And as you can see in the first bullet point, so I want to publish my results because I want to tell people, hey, this is something I believe I discovered and is something I believe may be useful to you. It may be useful because it's a new method. It may be useful because it contributes to, like, review papers, to better understanding the literature. It may be useful because it gives a reply to a previous paper. And also we may want to receive feedback and to get a feedback on our methods. But finally, there is another important reason why we write papers: to build our career. And there is nothing wrong in that. I mean, build a career as a researcher, as a university professor, as a person working in the research arena, we need to build our CV. And the scientific papers are an important part of the CV. Actually, in the past, it was considered that few papers were enough. One advice that I received when I started my career was don't publish too many papers. It's important to publish few very good papers. And then there was an explosion of the number of publications, and there was the internationalization. When I started my career in the 90s of the previous century, my first papers were written in Italian, and then there was a push to internationalization. Fortunately, I was stimulated to go international very soon. And then the number of papers published by people increased. So now it is also important to look at the number of papers. And this caused a kind of distortion of bias in the literature because people realized that, during a PhD, for instance, it's important to produce a minimum number of papers. And this stimulated the so-called publish or perish syndrome, and which means that if you want to move forward in your career, you have to publish. As I said, this was a distortion because the outcome was that there is an increasing number of papers that are not very good, that people publish just for building the career. And as I said, in principle, there is nothing wrong that we publish papers also for building our career. This was also my necessity, and I don't have any problem in admitting it. And even today, I have the necessity of maintaining a certain number of publications because when I make some applications for research funding, for instance, which is essential today, I am also evaluated for my recent production. So there is never, it's a never-ending story. The advice that I give to you is, as a reader, you have to be aware of that. So you have to be aware that there are some papers that even if they passed the peer review, because the peer review is not perfect, and it becomes increasingly imperfect, because there is an increasing number of papers submitted. So even as a reader, my suggestion is, even if the paper is published after peer review, beware that there are some papers that are not significant. And maybe they are not few. There are many of them that are not significant. As a writer, when we will discuss how to write a paper, my advice for you will be, it's fine that you look for good numbers in terms of number of published papers, but make sure that you don't publish poor papers, because one poor paper is enough to undermine the reputation of a researcher. If it is clear that a paper was poor, and it was clearly poor also at the beginning, this is not a good thing, because it's not only the number that matters, it's also the quality. But beware of this, and beware that there is nothing wrong. It's fine that some people publish paper to build their career. But of course, this makes the scientific literature more difficult to be browsed, scanned, interpreted, etc. So, but there is the peer review. The peer review, which we already introduced, is a key thing that you have to understand as a reader before than a writer. You have to understand whether the peer review was rigorous, was not rigorous, etc. You have first to understand whether a paper was peer reviewed. This is quite easy. When you find a paper, you look at the journal and you look at the instruction for authors. And there is the journal scope usually describing how the control is made. Let me give you an example. I am the editor-in-chief of this journal, and let me take a new search for AGU advances. Here we are, and this is the journal. Today, all the journals have a web page, of course, and then you see here there is a lot of information, recently published papers, etc., about, and you look here, aims and scope, and there is already information, journal overview, what type of papers, and it's an homework for you. Before the next lecture, before April 27, besides watching the videos, select a journal of your preference in the field you like and browse the web page and look at these menus. So there is browse here, current issue, all issues, have a look at the papers, highlight, these are highlighted papers, and so look at an highlighted paper. Commentaries, this is a particular paper type. It's not presenting new findings, but it's commenting on a general issue. Collections, collection of papers, grand challenges, special collections, and about aims and scope. Again, let's look here. These are the paper types accepted by the journal: research articles, viewpoints, commentaries, editorials, okay? And then there is here, submit an article. So if you click here, it gives to you instructions. It brings you to the submission site. This is not relevant to us because we are talking about reading. But here in about, there is also there is a lot of information which gives says if the journal is peer-reviewed. Okay, and I'm not sure whether we can find the information here. So the homework for you is try to browse the website of a journal. And if you don't find the information that you're looking for, you can ask artificial intelligence, or you can search over the web and ask, is AGO Advances peer-reviewed? And then you get this information. By the way, the article types is also extremely important when you get to writing. In order to see and the aims and scope, it's important for you as a reader and as a writer, because it explains what is the type of papers the journal is presenting. Let's close this and let's go back to our presentation. Sorry, here it is. So peer review. Peer review is a process in which a paper is evaluated by independent experts in the same field, expert working in the same field before it is published. Its main goal is to ensure the quality, validity, and the reliability of the research. I see some spelling errors here. Sorry for that. I will correct them. During peer review, the reviewers assess aspects such as the clarity of the research question, the appropriateness of the methods, the strength of the evidence, and the soundness of the conclusions. They may suggest revisions, request additional analysis, or identify potential weaknesses. Example, a reviewer may ask the authors to clarify the experimental design or include additional data. And of course, at the end of the story, the referee, the reviewer, says yes or no, and the paper can be published or not. How peer review works, just 1 second, I have to admit another person, very good. How peer review works, we submit a paper to the journal. Typically, the paper gets over the desk of an editor. Some journals have an editor-in-chief, which means that is the responsible person of a first screening. Other journals have a pool of editors. And so the responsible person makes a first screening, like, forgot to say, a first screening usually is made by the editorial office. They are staff, people that control whether the length of the paper is appropriate, whether the figures are readable, etc. And sometimes they send the paper back to the author saying, look, this is not good because there are too many references, the paper is too long, so you have to resubmit it. After the check of the editorial staff, the paper gets over the desk of the editor, and the editor usually makes a first check. There is an increasing trend by scientific journals to desk reject papers that are very poor. This means if the editor sees that the paper is clearly not good, it is immediately rejected or immediately asked for revision. This is because in view of the increasing number of submissions and in view of course, the overload of the reviewers, journals try to save the reviewers' time. Then if the editor is happy with the paper during the first assessment, then it is sent out to what is called an associate editor. Some journals don't have associate editors, some journals have. And what is the role of the associate editor is to help the editor and in particular to find the reviewers. The associate editor or the editor, if there is no associate editor, then asks a number of people to look at the paper. And this number of people depends on the journal, but usually it's typically a minimum of 2, and there is no upper limit. So I received sometimes 7 reviews on some of my papers, which is something really displeasing because, when too many reviews are received, then they can give opposite suggestions, and then it becomes a problem to revise the paper. But it may happen. And then when the reviews come back, the associate editor and the editor, they make a summary and say, look, dear colleague, the paper is rejected because the reviewers are not happy. So please submit somewhere else if you want. Or may ask for a major revision, a minor revision, or can publish it as is. It's very unlikely. Usually, I never had a paper published as is at the first submission. Usually, I am asked to make a revision. Very often, it's a minor one, in my case, but it depends on the field. It depends on many things. Sometimes it's a major one. And then the paper goes back to the journal, to the editor, and the editor typically sends it back to reviewers. And they may say, still, I'm not happy. And then you may get a second request to review the paper, and so forth. There are some journals that may decide in the second review round to involve new reviewers. Usually, this is considered something that is not in favor of the authors, because it happens quite frequently that the new reviewers find new issues. And maybe they give opposite suggestions to what has been suggested by the previous reviewers. So the whole process may become a bit complicated. The moral of the story is that when you submit a paper, you may expect on average, in my field, 1 year before the paper is published. When I get a paper published after 6 months, I congratulate editors and the editorial staff because it turned out to be very quick. And very often I am required to make 2 revisions, and hopefully at the second review round, the paper is finally accepted. There are some hiccups in the process, so sometimes the reviewers fail in delivering their report, and therefore the whole process may take longer. Sometimes it happened to me that after 1 year after the submission, I didn't get still any response. Today, there is a lot of more increasing attention to the velocity, to the efficiency of the process. So it doesn't happen frequently, but still sometimes it happens. And what is the final result? It is something that in most of the cases improves the original manuscript and allows to get a quality check. Then, in some of the cases, you may have to understand, also as a reader, that this process may, for some reasons, lower the quality of the paper. Sometimes when I read papers, I see some sections that looks not very connected with the others. And my first feeling is that it was a reviewer who suggested to add this section. Of course, the author had to add it because it was required. But at the end of the story, this section is not really well placed into context. However, keep into account that the authors have the opportunity to reboot the suggestion of the reviewers. When we resubmit the paper, we usually are required to include a document called rebuttal document explaining how we addressed the reviewer comments. And sometimes I took the opportunity to say, sorry, I don't agree with the reviewer, and I decided to keep the paper as is. And when authors take such a decision, my advice is always to be very careful and very kind in the wording of the text, because, you understand why. So, as I said, the process is not perfect. So sometimes it may happen that the reviewer doesn't have time and therefore says just a few comments but not after a very deep assessment. So the quality check may weaken a little bit. And if the editor doesn't realize it, then the final result is that a poor paper may be published. So this is what I suggest to my student, and I say, look, if you submit to a poor quality journal, then the risk is that you get a paper published that is poor, and this is risky. This, what I just said, gives to me the opportunity to give you an advice that is very useful as a reader. The peer review, usually, is connected to the quality of the journal. A journal, a very good quality journal, means that the peer review is likely to be higher quality with respect to the peer review of a poor quality journal. Of course, there are exceptions. So it is something that doesn't apply to every single paper. But this is, in general, what happens. And therefore, as a reader, you have the first thing that you have to check is the quality of the journal. How do you check it? And you check it through the journal metrics. I already closed the web page of AGU Advances, but if you remember, in the About menu, there was journal metrics. Journal metrics means that they are essentially reporting indexes of quality. These indexes of quality have been highly criticized recently because they are automatically computed based on statistics like citations, so the number of times a paper has been downloaded and referenced in subsequent papers, in follow-up papers. And these automatic classifications sometimes are a bit misleading. So it's a good thing that you look at the journal metrics, but it's not the only one. The other important thing is the advice of your advisor. Any specific field, a person working in a specific field knows, I perfectly know in hydrology what are the good journals and what are the journals that are not as good. What is the benefit? You may ask, what is the benefit of publishing on a poor journal? The benefit is that the peer review process is usually less rigorous. And therefore, sometimes when I get a paper to be submitted by my students or by myself, my colleagues, if I have some doubts about the value of the paper, I think it is good, but not really exceptional, I don't submit to top quality journals because I know that it's likely to be rejected. I submit to maybe middleweight journals. I try to avoid the very poor ones, and this is also what I tell my students. So as a reader, also, you have to recognize the quality of a journal. So let me give you an example. Science. Science, it's a very top quality journal. It's unlikely that you find over there something that is not deserving attention. Another example, Nature, top quality. I would say, but this is just my personal opinion, that probably Science is even higher. But this is just my personal opinion. And then there are, in Nature, several subset journals like Nature Geoscience, Nature Water, Nature whatever. These are lower quality, and you can look at the journal metrics, or you can ask your advisor. So as a reader, this is extremely important that you assess it, because it has reflections on the peer review, and it has reflections then on the quality of the paper. Okay, now let's take the second questionnaire. I keep going with my last 17 minutes of lecturing, but meanwhile, please complete this second questionnaire, which is here. So this is general introduction, and it's here, motivation to read and trust in scientific papers. I put the link in the chat, and then I will present to you the results during the next lecture. because I want to save time today. What happens if reviewers are your competitors who try to avoid your publication? Okay, let me see. There are two questions. It is suggested to translate your paper, or it's better to just write them in English and at most in your native language? Are the translations considered the same as the original paper? Okay, short answer, yes, they are considered the same. It is allowed to make a translation, but you should not give twice the credit to yourself. A general suggestion related to writing, which we will expand when we discuss writing papers. Avoid salami publishing. Salami publishing means that instead of writing one comprehensive paper, you write 10 papers describing subsequent step of your research. Salami publishing is very detrimental. If it is recognized during the assessment of your CV, it's very bad for you. So it's fine. I wrote many papers in English, translated in Italian, but then usually when I make the list of publications in my CV, I don't put twice the same paper, even if it's written in a different language. Okay, depending on the CV that you are preparing, you have to be careful not to duplicate the value of your research. Okay, what happens if reviewers are your competitors who try to avoid your publication? This happens, and of course, it's one of the problem of peer review. The reviewers may be your friends, and then it means that they usually say, yes, this deserves to be published, which means that the quality of that paper is impacted, or maybe your enemies or your competitors, as you said, which try not to publish, to try to avoid you publishing these results. It may also happen that the reviewers reject your paper and then take the opportunity to develop ideas on what they have reviewed. This last attitude is unethical, strongly unethical, and be careful because we will talk about ethics later on. And if you make something ethically not correct, you have to avoid it because your career is destroyed forever. So I think it is very unlikely that a reviewer rejects a paper and then builds over it because it's very, very, very risky, especially today, because today there is the way to check everything over the web. In the past, it was more difficult. You know, when papers were printed only on paper, it was more difficult to make checks. But today it is checked. So plagiarism, building on others' ideas without recognizing them, these are unethical behaviors. Avoid them by all means. But of course, if the reviewer simply rejects the paper because they don't like you, and then that's it, this is something that is not unethical. Or, I mean, it's unethical but cannot be discovered, I mean. Or maybe that the reviewers are wrong, and they may suggest to reject a paper because they didn't understand it. So what happens then in this case? First of all, you have the opportunity to give the names of the reviewers to the journal whom you don't want to review your paper. And you have the opportunity to instead suggest referees. And my advice for you, always suggest referees. And then when you get the reviews back, you can make an appeal to the editor, like, sorry, the claim of this reviewer is wrong. And you demonstrate why it's wrong. And usually, even in top journals, the appeals are taken very seriously. So you are protected against unethical behavior and against simple will of not promoting your research, personal will of dispromoting your research. You are protected. But of course, in some cases, using this protection may be a bit difficult. It makes things more complicated. I tell you, I had several experiences where even the editor was rejecting my papers for reasons which I believe were not motivated, and I engaged in strong discussions. There is nothing wrong that you contact the editor and say, look, please look for another reviewer because I don't think this is an unbiased review. And at the beginning is a bit, something shocking. And when you get experienced, then it becomes quite something that I don't say it's normal, but you get trained to it. Okay, the results of the questionnaire I will publish. I will discuss them later on. So why read scientific papers? Let's skip this because I think we already learned why. And I assume that you are interested, and you may be interested for several reasons. Another thing that I want to give an example to you of scientific papers that I decided to read not for motivations not related to my profession, medicine. When it happens frequently to me that I look over the media and there are recommendations like how to live 100 years. And there is something like eat only a particular kind of food, avoid this kind of food. And then I'm looking for the scientific references. So I read a lot of scientific papers related to medicine, related to diet, because I wanted to see if the journal, the newspaper, was reporting the information in a correct manner. I give you an example. There is an important Italian journal who suggested, I think a couple of weeks ago, that there was a certain attitude, and I don't want to give more details, a certain attitude that lowered our probability to die by cancer 20%. And I thought, but 20% with respect to what? To a baseline determined with what kind of research? And they mentioned the paper. I went to the paper. It was not in Google Scholar, which is a repository which we will discuss soon to find papers. And then the journal was referring to a conference paper. And then I went to the conference paper. The conference paper was clearly bad. It was a bad paper, not reviewed, and without details, something. And my conclusion was, well, this is an important Italian newspaper published, translated, literally translated, a contribution that is poor. And this is something that shouldn't happen. Okay, so our motivation to read scientific papers may be widespread, but the important thing that I wanted to say to conclude this mention, this experience that I recently had, my experience in reading papers was very useful because I could understand that what was reported by the newspaper was not correct. Okay, now I think we can also skip this, but there is one thing that I wanted to take from this slide. What is the difference, which I already considered a little bit, between a paper and a book? A book usually is the summary of a review of the literature and is therefore a second step. So the book is expected to present results that in some ways are digested after reading scientific papers. It's a third, it's one more pass, because it may happen that scientific papers then are criticized later on and proved to be wrong. So this is something that you have to keep in mind. Science actually progresses in this way, by proving that some previous results were wrong or were incomplete. And therefore, keep in mind that even if the paper was peer-reviewed, even if the journal is high quality, you have always to keep some doubt about the fact that the result is very recent, is something that has not been digested, is something like history. When you look at history, very often we know that historians present the history after 50 years, after the involved people were died, after they had the time to digest the information, because this is the time that is needed. So, I mean, when you read a paper, you shouldn't trust it blindly, a scientific paper, but you should always keep some doubt about it. It's important to recognize how to work with these doubts, how to elaborate them. And this is the purpose of what we discuss. Okay, now let's go to reading then. And let's understand better what is the typical structure of a scientific paper. I understand that for many of you, this is something that is quite well known, but I think actually that we need first to understand that what is presented here is not generally valid. There are some disciplines where scientific papers are structured in a different way. There are some disciplines where, for instance, the results are presented very briefly, or the methods are presented very briefly, or there are some papers where the methods are not presented. And we will give some examples. And in particular, the first video that I prepared for you to watch explains that some journals don't report the methods in the same publication. But this is the general structure that we refer to. So basically, what you have to look in a paper, and this is better specified in the first video, is, and they are not mentioned here, title, of course. You look at the title, it's the first thing that you look at. And keep in mind what I'm saying helps you to read papers, but will help also you to write papers. So the first thing that I look in a paper is the title. And I told you I am also editor-in-chief of a journal with a good reputation. When a paper is submitted, first thing is the title. And in half of the cases, I can gain a very informed opinion by only looking at the title. And then there is a second component that is not always present, but usually is, which is not mentioned here, is the summary or the abstract, better known as the abstract. The abstract is the second thing I look at, if it is there. It is very short and presents a summary. Some journals require a plain language summary. Usually they are the more generalist journals, those who publish not only paper for researchers working in the specific field, but papers that may be read by the large community of scientists. The plain language summary is also important. So when I, as an editor, I look at a paper, first the title, and then the abstract. If there is the plain language summary, I read it. There is one more thing that I read if it is there, it's the cover letter, but as a reader it's not important, we will discuss it later. Some journals also require the key points. So you have to list 3 sentences explaining what is the added value of your paper. If they are there, it's the first thing, one of the first things you have to read. Okay, so they are not mentioned here. Title, abstract, plain language summary, key points. Also the keywords, but the keywords are more important for tracking the paper than understanding the content. And as I said, very often I get a very clear overview of the content of the paper. When I make a review of the literature, search for paper, usually I reject, I mean, I avoid to read 1/4 of the papers that I find with the review search, basing on just reading the journal, the title, and the abstract. Okay, and then the body of the paper. The body of the paper, the usual structure is called IMRAD, which is introduction, methods, results, and discussion. Introduction presents the research question, gives the background, and explain then the motivation of your study and motivation of the study and the summary of the findings, so the methods and the findings. So this is the problem that I am interested in. This is the way I am addressing it, and this is what I discovered. This is often included in the introduction. And then we may have the methods section, describes the data and how the study was carried out. The results, reports the finding, and the discussion and or conclusions, where there is an interpretation of the results and an explanation why the results are important, a detailed explanation. So when you read a paper, you have to look to the components that I mentioned earlier: title, abstract, plain language summary, and then key points. And then you look at the introduction, method, result, discussion. The introduction is also extremely important because it's an extended description of the problem and the way you solved it. Normally, after reading the introduction, I refine my search to half of the initial number of papers, because I may conclude, okay, this is not relevant to what I was looking for. Perfect. This is a graphical explanation of the IMRAD structure. Here, the abstract is summarized, it's also reported, and then introduction, method, results, and discussion or conclusion, and or conclusion. Some papers have discussion and conclusions. Usually, I have several colleagues suggesting the students to incorporate both discussion and conclusion. I am a fan of short papers, also because the publication fees, which we will discuss later, are higher for long papers. So I am a fan of short papers. So I prefer to tell my students to include either the discussion or the conclusion, because sometimes I find that it's a repetition, and this is not good. Okay, and there are differences, of course, between the results and the discussion sections. I leave to you the task of going through these differences, which are quite obvious. I mean, discussion is an interpretation of the results. The results section is a presentation of the results. It's a different thing. And but again, I leave browsing this figure to you, and then we are approaching the end of the lecture. Give me a couple of minutes more. And why the structure is important? It is important because your reading is made easier if these papers follow this conventional structure. If they don't follow this conventional structure, you may have some interpretation problems. Maybe sometimes good that you make your paper different when you, or maybe that as a reader, you are attracted from a paper that has a different structure. But especially at the beginning of your reading experiences, at the beginning of your writing experiences, it's better to refer to a well-codified structure, which allows a better understanding. And a better understanding leads to improved reproducibility, improved transparency, improves comparability. But again, sometimes I wrote unconventional papers, but after 20 years of experience, not soon. And sometimes I am reading now unconventional paper, but I find it a bit challenging. So at the beginning, I prefer to give this suggestion. Try to refer to papers that are following a structured format. And here you see the life cycle. So you have of a paper. So first, the research question. So first you decide, maybe as a student, what is the problem I am interested in, and what is an open research question. And at the beginning, you need an advice of an advisor. And then you collect the data and you make your experiments, and you make sure during the space to propose something innovative. And then you write the paper. When you have finished the computation, you have your results at hand, and you realize that they are important. You are just at the beginning of the story of the paper. You have finished the results, but then you have to write it. And writing a paper, my advisor during my PhD always said, you need a month, one full month of work to write a paper after getting the whole body of your results. I don't think it's a unique indication. Sometimes it happened to me to write a paper in a couple of days, but still it is, I mean, when you have finished your computation or you have finished your conclusion, you are just at the beginning. And then there is the submission. And what I tell my students, I always tell them, look, the difficult period is when you receive the reviews. It's not writing that difficult. It's revising the paper that becomes very difficult. And then there is publication. So we say that usually you have to plan during a PhD, in my field, writing 2-3 papers in my field. In other fields, the number may be lower or larger. Okay, and why it's maybe difficult to read, of course, because the technical language and the background knowledge. And in the video that you will watch after this lecture, you will get information on how to overcome these problems. So how to quickly read the paper. Let me see how many slides. Oh, okay, I think, let me just check. I think this is the last one. Yes, the last but one. So just keep in mind that even for experienced scientists, sometimes reading paper is difficult. And especially if they are outside our own field. And so just keep in mind that you need some tricks, and which we will try to learn all together. And so don't get discouraged, okay? So it's quite normal when you read your very first paper that you take one full week to read it. And the second time you take half time, and at the end of the story, in 10 minutes, when you are skilled, you read a paper. So this is my closing message, and I don't think we need to comment on it because I leave to you to read this closing message. So next step for you is to look at the website of a scientific journal and watch the video that is already available in my website, and maybe also the next one. I'm not sure when I will make it available, but I may make it available, made it available before April 27. If I succeed, I will send you a message over the forum and the chat of Teams, and so that you can also watch the second video. That's it for now. So I see that almost 40 people are still attending, so thank you very much. And one recommendation for you. If you have any comment on my lecturing, is too easy, it's too complicated, I speak too fast, I speak too slow, just send me an email, a private message if you don't want, or a message in the chat. I don't mind if any criticism is shared. I just would like that to take benefit from your suggestions to make sure that I meet your expectations with the next 2 lectures. Thanks, and that's it. You can also ask questions over the chat of Teams offline, and I will reply to you offline. Thanks. Bye-bye.